Well, okay, obviously you know why you're here, elements and principles of design. Elements of design are the foundation of art, and so it's a very good topic for BrickCon 24, Foundations. Who am I? I am an industrial designer, as Diane told you. Industrial design is product design, but the elements of design are used in, the elements of art, I should say, and the principles of design are used across all sorts of artistic fields, whether it is film or fashion or product design or art. One of the reasons I decided to give this talk was that I think of art supplies, I think of Lego specifically as art supplies. It's the best art supply you can purchase for the money. You can reuse it almost infinitely if you kind of ignore the brown, brittle brown, reddish brown. But it retains its value. You can use it over and over and over again. There's not many art supplies that allow you to do that. So I think of this as art, but I also know that most of you don't have an art background or an art degree, maybe never took even a course in art. Show of hands, who here does not have a degree in art? Good, we're in the right place. And if you do have a degree in art, I know you're still curious, so that's okay. The elements, and why are we learning them? They're the building blocks, they're the fundamentals, they're the foundation of art. The principles are the intentional use of these elements to achieve an effect. Usually that's what we call design, whether it's product design, car design, graphic design, advertising. They have an intentional use to achieve a desired effect. I'm gonna slow down because I'm talking too fast. The elements and the principles are the very first lessons that trained artists and designers are taught. This is why I'm talking up here, is you're gonna get a 50-minute crash course in a one-semester course from art school, which means I'm just gonna barely touch the surface. I'm gonna scratch on these things. I'm gonna give you some key phrases that you're gonna learn, some key terms you're gonna learn. Those are in those word searches for you online. That word search is available in the Discord. You can find it there and enjoy it at your leisure. Why are we learning these? They help you create, evaluate, and improve your art. You don't have to use them all, just like you don't use every single letter in the alphabet when you sign your name. But you know they're all there, and you know which ones to use and why you want to use them. I'm going to talk about 8 elements that I was taught and 8 principles that I was taught. And these are not necessarily going to be the same that you might find from other instructors, because each person takes a few, they rename a few. The names may not be 100% the same as what some of our art teachers might have heard. But these are the 8 that I was taught, and hopefully they will help you as we go through this. So, big long list. Keywords, find them in your word search. They are point, line, shape, form, space, color, value, and texture. Many instructors don't bother giving you point, but point is really kind of important, especially as Lego builders. And you'll start seeing comparison in here. If you want more detail on any of the topics I'm talking about, there's a world of resources online. It helps to know the terms elements of art, principles of design, and these 8 terms. So the first one, point. A point is the beginning of all of the art elements. It's also the end of a sentence. The vertical dots, when you put points together, start to imply motion. They can imply a line. They can imply a direction or a shape. If you look at this image, what shape do you see? I heard 2 different answers, and there they both are, a pentagon and a star. The wonderful thing about points is we see them as dot to dot. We see them as the collection of points helps define things. They are strongly used for not only lines and shapes, but also mosaics. So we have many downstairs. Lego has gone to making a whole selection of points available to you as mosaics. Mandalas also. And then in many older times, pointillism. Mosaics are nearly as old as civilization. They started in about 3000 BCE in Mesopotamia. And individually, points are the only elements that you'll be taught that do not trigger emotion by themselves. As a collection, they can, but individually, they don't trigger emotion. Something weird and fantastic about them. Line. Line is our second element. It used to define shape. I'm going to talk about these images that I have up here. So I have pictures from Lego. I have pictures of things that I've created, but I've also taken some things from other people, and there should be credit for them on there as we go. This Lego postcards build uses line in 3 different ways. It uses it to define the direction and orientation of movement that's happening in these shooting stars or meteorites that are going through. It's used to demonstrate energy in the curved line, the curved yellow line at the beginning of the shape. And it's used in the strata of the atmosphere to give you location and context of where this is occurring. So qualities of line, you can see the jagged lines used by Dana or Virginia Bricks in her mosaic. The jagged line, a curved line, all these things are still lines. And they're used in multiple ways to connect, separate, and demonstrate energy. One of the other early things that art teachers give us is the task to use a single line drawing to demonstrate contour. What is contour? Contour is not only the outline of a shape, but it's the individual defining features of an item. So for an elephant, it's not just the big ears and trunk. It also involves, the eyes, the shape of the trunk, the texture of it, and the tusks that are going on there. Kelly did a wonderful job of translating a single line drawing that her daughter did into this Lego piece. And here is an enlargement of how she did it, what pieces she used. So Kelly has taken line to create shape, which is our third element. Shape is a 2-dimensional contour of an area. It can be rectilinear, squared off, like our bricks often are. It can be curved or free-flowing. And the interesting thing I find about shape is that if you can do it really well and tessellate 2 shapes together in such a way, you can lose all figure and ground. Shapes also include icons, letters, and numbers. They are because they have an implied boundary. And the boundary that you get out of a shape doesn't have to be defined by a line. It can be defined by color, texture, or value. We're up to number 4, form. Form is a 3-dimensional shape. Now, it's a shape with volume or implied volume. So up here, you see the nice little 2x2 brick with a cutout, except it's not. This is a 2-dimensional representation of that. How do our minds translate that into a 3D shape is the difference in value on the various faces that we interpret as 3-dimensional. But form, there are 3 types of main forms: geometric, natural, and amorphous. And I've tried to give you some examples that you would see out of Lego. The illusions of these 3 dimensions come from the next elements we're going to talk about. Space. Thank you. Space in art is the area around, within, or between objects. Space gives you can have the illusion of space from a number of different things. These 2 trees are placed in such a way that they add a little bit of space. It's hard to see with trees because they're naturalistic, but if these had been telephone poles in that exact same size and orientation, you would see that they're receding away from you as you look from right to left. And you would see because one of them is raised higher at the bottom and is smaller in size. So both of those things give you a bit of space. This piece also, Daniel has a little bit of color value, just a hint of color in the background to give you atmospheric perspective in addition to the linear perspective that is going on there. Now, oftentimes we talk about positive space and negative space in art, positive space being the elements that you're putting out there, and negative space being the things and the breathing space around you. Also could be considered figure and ground is another term used for it. And the negative space is also sometimes just called white space, which is what you probably are used to and seeing in textbooks and things like that. But it doesn't have to be white. It can be a different color. And speaking of color, this is our next element. We're up to what, 6 now, I think? Yeah. Color is the chromatic quality of an item. I have spent semesters in color theory, and there's a lot going on there. I'm not going to try and cover all of that right now. You all have a basic idea of what color means. If you want a whole class on color theory, ask for it, or go see Paige Bissett's little unicorns down in the art tables. She's got a nice little setup there for us. But color theory will tell you that the effects of color are huge on people. Madison Avenue knows this. That's why advertising works. You'll also hear that cool colors can recede while warm colors advance. Bright colors also advance and dark colors also recede. So there's a lot of things going on with that. But okay, what is a bright color and what is a dark color? Well, that gets us to value, our 7th element. You see here, value is the tone of a color. How it's also considered shading. It's very easy for an artist to take a pencil and shade an area and make a shadow. It's very hard for a Lego artist to do that. You have to think ahead in terms of finding different tints, light colors, or shades, darker colors, in a color to give it dimension. This mosaic is completely flat. There's no layers to it. There's no popping out of anything, yet it's very clearly Han Solo trapped in carbonite. Value also is the thing that helps us get shapes. You remember back to our 2x2 brick with a cutout. Those values help define the shape of your two-dimensional figure and turn it from shape into form. All right, and our final one is texture. Final one of the 8 I was taught was texture. Texture is the surface quality of an object. We see this all the time in Lego, whether you want studs on or studs off. But you can imply more texture than is actually there as well. In this image, you see that you can see the folds of the fabric of this flag through tone and the gradation that's happening. I want to talk a little bit about this picture. This is actually my Lego mosaic of a painting my mom did in watercolor for the bicentennial ages ago. But then I took it and I greebled it, and now it even has more texture. So now, not in addition to the tonal texture that we have with the colors and the shades and the tints, we have a lot more dynamicism, including actual physical shadow. So I know some of you are going to look at this and go, but wait, what is greebling? So Greeblies, comes from the Lucas Model Factory in ILM. They would do kit bashing, which is taking old car sets, old boat sets, old little crafty sets, and they would pull off all the little interesting details and they would glue them onto the ships that they were building for Star Wars. And so the Greeblies comes from that. Lego AFOLs have kind of adopted it into greebling, which is just giving anything as amount of texture in there. You'll see all sorts. I've got all sorts of pieces in that greebled image. But you can see the shape of the flag implies texture as well as the color and values. Okay, now we're going to go, we've covered a lot of elements of design. We covered point, we covered line, we covered shape, we covered form, we colored space. There you go. We covered color, value, and texture. Those are the 8 elements. You're using the use of those 8 elements are what we're going to be talking about next in terms of the principles. Okay, so the 8 principles I'm going to talk about, well, 8.5 because unity and harmony are in there together. These are the ones I was taught. These names may vary a little depending on who you talk to or what resources you're looking at for principles of design. But these are the ones that are used to intentionally make art elements do what you want them to do and have the effect you want with your viewer. So they include balance, emphasis, contrast, repetition, sometimes called rhythm, sometimes called pattern. I always think of it as repetition because the repetition creates the rhythm and creates the pattern. Movement, proportion, unity and harmony, which feels so close sometimes they're hard to keep apart. I'm going to try and give you a tip for that. And variety. So balance. We think of balance as a teeter-totter or a seesaw, where you have one big thing on the right and one big thing on the left, and then they sit together and it's balanced, right? Well, visually, we don't always have to have them exactly the same for them to be balanced. But that symmetrical balance, that kind of balance where you think of exact same things on a teeter-totter is the symmetrical balance. You can have asymmetrical balance where you have one big thing on one side and several little things on the other. Or you can have rotational balance, such as this image, where things are kind of balanced, but they're kind of going around in a circle. Balance creates equilibrium. Balance creates calm. You don't have to use balance. In fact, you can intentionally not use balance in order to create something different. Symmetrical balance is also sometimes called formal balance. It's usually mirror image across the vertical axes. Asymmetrical balance is also sometimes called informal balance. But they're still balanced because they have roughly equivalent weight, or at least visual or mental weight. No balance at all creates discomfort or tension, but that may be your intention, so you want to keep that in mind. Emphasis. Emphasis is about where you want your eye to go. We use it to draw attention. We use it to create interest. We use it to establish priority. In this image, there's emphasis being drawn by not only color and texture, but value and contrast. The location doesn't really necessarily establish emphasis without use of another object. While this is in the center, if she had placed this particular white palette, which I know you're all looking at because that's what she's got as emphasis, if you'd placed it pretty much anywhere else on this rainbow, except maybe in the yellow area, there would be enough to draw attention from the contrast. But the arrows and the shapes and the lines swirling inward also drive you towards that. But if you'd moved all of that off to a different corner or off to a different area of this image, you still would be drawn to that because of those unique elements. It's not that it's placed in the center, it's that it's placed at the apex of all of those lines and shapes forming your eye, drawing your eye in there. So, okay, how else can I create this? You can create it by direction and movement. Proximity or hierarchy. Something larger is obviously going to draw more attention than something small. Something that's close to things that you're close and busy is going to be one type of emphasis. Sometimes something all by itself can be emphasized because it's set apart. And then contrast, especially here we've got contrast. And that leads us to the next principle, which is contrast. So in this image by John and Aileen, there's a nice amount of contrast happening here. Obviously, the yellow windows on a black background of a silhouette of a house on a white background of clouds. Those color contrasts are very easy for us to remember and think about. But there's other contrasts happening here too. The very ornate figure of a bat against a very smooth shape of a moon creates contrast. The figures down in the front, the white little bright figures in the front across a dark green background. The figures in the front, not only by value, but they're more intricately shaped. The height kind of pops up across the smooth green rolling hills that are behind them. And then the pops of orange as well. So color, obvious contrast, but some of these elements have contrast by texture as well. So color, texture, two of our elements that we're using here in contrast. Some of these lines are also differencing. We've got some thick and wavy lines in the clouds. We've got some straight lines in the building. Those contrasts as well can affect how you view everything that's happening here. This image just pops. I love it. Okay. Repetition. The principle of repetition is that you create pattern and texture and rhythm from these things. I think of repetition as the visual version of tempo. If you've got a beat going. And as any piano teacher will tell you, and any advertising exec knows, repetition, that which is repeated will be remembered. Now we have the principle of movement. In visual design, movement is where you get the chance to kind of guide your person through the story. It can be a road that drives you along a pathway. It can be anything that kind of creates that flow. Back in these postcards from space, we saw movement being defined by just a simple line. It didn't take much, but it was there. There was the principle of movement that was happening in those lines. Here we have wavier lines. Proportion. Proportion is the principle of the relative scale of things. Not necessarily just in shape, but also in number. So this image would seem completely in proportion if you didn't have that little guy in there trying to manage this giant pencil. Realistic proportion gives you calmness because it's balanced. Unrealistic proportion draws surprise. And we've seen lots of things where things are enlarged or reduced, and that makes much more interesting visual effects. But you need to know why those create those visual effects. Unity and harmony. Sounds like a song. These are very closely related principles. Unity talks about the whole of the project. Is everything unified? Does everything fit together? This was Brad Bergman's art piece from last year. Harmony is all of the elements in there. Do they harmonize? Are they similar to one another? So while this piece has, what I see in this piece in terms of harmony is everything's about the paint. Everything's happening there is being painted. You've got a bunch of little painters doing their painting job on the top. You've got paint drips happening all throughout. But what leads your eye through that story and unifies it all is that roller coaster ride that kind of draws you through everything. And all the parts are cohesive, they're consistent, and they all work together. So unity is the whole of it. Harmony, does each element have harmony? So that's kind of the slight difference between them. But honestly, if you use them interchangeably, you'll probably not have a problem. But what happens if you don't want everything unified and you don't want harmony? Well, this piece has harmony because each element is similar to each other. They have cohesion. They are all botanical, but they're not necessarily what you would call unity. It's more variety because there's so much difference in them, in the texture and the shape and the color. And you do that to add interest and complexity and diversity. These are for creating contrast, use it to create surprise. And this is my final principle. So, elements, building blocks of art. They include point, line, shape, form, space, color, value, and texture. And the principles are what designers and other artists use to intentionally create effects by using those elements. So they're the tools in the toolbox. And they include balance, emphasis, contrast, repetition, movement, proportion, unity and harmony, and variety. Now, the number of principles, these are the ones I was taught. Number and names may vary a little from instructor to instructor. And I promise you, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Any one of these elements or principles you could dive much deeper into, but we spent probably 3 class sessions for an entire week on I covered 16 different elements. That'd be a 16-week course. It's condensed because we've crashed this down into a very short time frame. But that was what I came here to tell you about, and I'm open to take questions.
I was following along, and in my head, the example that I used for myself for unity, harmony, and variety was unity would be like every set within a specific series of a Lego theme. So like Unitron would all be in unity with each other because all the sets are like, you could just look at them and be like, these are all part of one set.
Yep.
But they exist in harmony with all other classic space series because you'll see them, in the Lego magazine, you'd see them with like Blacktron or Blacktron 2 or Mtron or, any of the other themes that are in Lego Classic Space would all be there. And then when you expand to variety, you're including like Classic Castle, Classic Pirates, all the other variety of themes that Lego produces.
That is certainly one good way of looking at it.
All right. I was kind of like, is that like a valid take on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Usually we're talking about the elements in a particular piece.
In a particular piece, yes.
But looking at a holistic, I'm sure the Lego planners are looking at an entire line of their product in that way.
And considering that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. You wouldn't want a hodgepodge of, variety is nice, but you wouldn't want to have like 100 different things that didn't have any cohesion together.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you manage colors in your artistic toolbox when, as time goes on, Lego introduces and discontinues colors?
Well, there's a lot of bricklink that happens. It's tricky. I got very excited when all the new blues got added because now finally you have different tones across the blues. And it's only been, since I think the dots came in that we started getting tones within the purples as well. We had, the purple we had was so dark and deep. It was a shade of itself. So how do I manage them? I can't say that I actually do. I just get excited when new colors show up, and sometimes I'll have and I do still have entire bins that are just this color, which I usually start by part. But when a new color arrives, it's like, oh, sand green, you're my friend.
We have a question from online.
Mm-hmm.
What about perspective and/or how do all of these elements and principles relate to things that we look at from above versus at eye level?
That's a very good question. So the perspective is a part of the process of emphasis and also form, weirdly enough. Perspective is used to drive what form looks like, so that especially when you're dealing with two-dimensional things and you're trying to make it look like it has depth to it, that's illusionary. But I think what the question sounded like it was getting to is like the viewing angle of a particular piece. I will admit, these elements and principles were designed primarily for 2D artists and 2D methodologies. Sculptors kind of went and did their own thing for the most part. But these are the foundations, the rooted areas for these, for even sculptors and industrial designers who have to make cars and shapes like that. So how things are looked at, there's an entire class on that, I'm sure, from viewing different forms from different angles and taking a look at it. I took a class in technical graphics, which technically also made me take a version of an image from looking at the front, looking at the side, looking at the top, and then looking at it what we call isometrically, which is kind of at that angle. And so I got very good at 3D spatial things, and I imagine many of you are pretty good with 3D spatial things, having put together some brick. That's usually where that kind of comes in. And honestly, I'll talk about this tomorrow in my next talk a little bit, but that's where you evaluate. You just have to take a look at it from a different angle, and see how things are shaping up. Shape and form, also talk about size of things and how they relate to each other to give you that balance and emphasis of what is in front of another thing, because obviously layering things makes a difference in terms of what you perceive to be in front. If I have a shape and that cuts into a different shape, you perceive the shape that is full to be in front. And we do that sometimes with size in foreshortening. I know a lot of people have made mocks that have foreshortened images, where you'll have a much larger figure in the front, and then you create a background that is much smaller, that allows you to perceive that it is even farther back than it really is.
When you're building, do you have an element or principle that kind of is your go-to to start with? Are you driven by color? Are you driven by, okay, I like the contrast and things? Where do you start from?
I don't necessarily start from the elements and the principles. I use them to evaluate what I've done. It's like, okay, now this is what I've got here. Does that look right? What principles am I tapping into, and what effect do those principles drive towards? A lot of the principles you heard me talk about can create calmness or a feeling of contentment, whereas driving away from them can create anxiety, but also interest or surprise. So I think of it more in that way. It's more of an evaluation tool for me, but there's also a lot of planning that has to happen. Obviously, we see with value and color choices, there's a lot of planning you want to have in mind. If I want to make that flag image, I pull out the blue, but I also pull out the lighter blues and the medium azures, and I pull out the dark blues, and I pull out all the other things so that I can give that field of stars a little bit more texture from color. So there are some things that you plan out, but there are some things that you just kind of look at it again. Okay, which element am I mean, the elements you're using are brick primarily, but what principles am I tapping into when I'm dealing with these things? But it's very hard to evaluate when you don't necessarily have this tool in your toolbox. So I hope that gives all of you something to draw upon. Any other questions?
Here's another one from online. Are there any memorable rules of thumb to follow to create good Lego creations based on all of these principles?
Well, the first rule of thumb is don't use them all. Be selective. The intersection of the principles and how they use different elements, like I said, this is an entire semester of classwork that I am cramming together into this 50-minute presentation. If there's one that speaks to you, perhaps repetition. I use repetition quite a lot in my mosaic work. If that speaks to you, dig into it, look it up, research it, find an art teacher, take them out for coffee, pick their brain, or dig into. There's actually a number of these principles and elements highlighted on YouTube, online. We have the wealth of the world's knowledge at our fingertips anymore. So, but it's hard to know what to look for if you haven't been schooled in this initially.
I think what Ashley online is trying to get at is, are there certain ones that kind of work together commonly? So she asks, for instance, balance, repetition, and harmony might nearly always look good, whereas chaos, imbalance, and contrast may be bad. So certain things that work together.
certain things that work together. I actually would challenge you to experiment with them. See what works for you. What works for me might be a little different than what works for you. Like I said, I work with repetition a lot because of just some of the choices I've made and the things I wanted to make. But repetition does not drive itself to emphasis necessarily. It does not drive itself to contrast. However, depending on which elements you use, you can use texture or you could use shape or value to make them drive you towards emphasis. Emphasis usually is probably the one that we experience the most in our lives because that's the one Madison Avenue is giving you in all of your advertising. They are using emphasis to drive your eye to the thing they want you to remember, to the thing they want you to do, which is usually give them money. So they find ways to use emphasis. And if you know these principles, you can start seeing them in other pieces of art. If you see them in graphic design and package design and advertising, which used to be a lot more in print, but now is more digital and online. I hope that answered the question.
I was wondering, we're obviously a room full of adults here, but and you're talking about college courses, I'm assuming, when you say all these things, but are these some things that we can start teaching to children? And at what age would you start?
Oh,
I
yes.
mean, obviously, babies are really interested in things like patterns, but if I take this home and teach it to my baby, obviously that's not appropriate, but do you think there's like an age where we'd start using these words? Or?
There's certainly, I mean, you can start working with elements right away. There's nothing stopping you. It's like, this is a shape, this is a line, this is a point. That's very easy. When you're getting into the more complex things about principles, you're talking about intent and you're talking about purpose and what you're trying to get at. And usually the cognitive brain, and now you're going to get into my whole background on developmental child psychology, usually that brain for children starts kicking in into the 12 to, somewhere between 11 and 13. They're just starting into their teenage years, sometimes a little later. They start understanding not only what things are happening, but why they're happening. And that's what the principles are about. They're about the why of this, whereas the elements are more about the what of art.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. It's been great to talk to you, and go make art.